I'm going to go over a very important paper that's actually just a web page on the internet, but it should be a paper. Population differences in individualism. This is an online resource that I did refer to Kevin MacDonald prior to his publication of the book on individualism in the Western liberal tradition. I want to point to a graph to start out with, skipping to the most salient fact, which is if you look at the individualism axis, you'll notice that the USA is at the extrema. Now, this isn't necessarily very much of a surprise to people, but it is important to keep this in mind. There's a gradient, obviously, that goes from the USA to other countries, and Western Europeans are prominent. The vertical axis is interpersonal trust, and China is an outlier from the rest of the nations in having both low individualism and high interpersonal trust that we can go into, but that's more of a distraction from the primary point that I'm trying to get to in this paper. We have another graph, which is by state in the United States of the degree of collectivism, which is the inverse of individualism, versus social capital, which shows that as you have more individualism, you have more social capital, or versus the more collectivism, you have less social capital. And this is consistent with other findings that show that social capital is subverted by immigration and diversity out of Harvard. So let's go through and talk about these characteristics, which will bear on some of the other points we're going to try to make here. We've got others classified as individuals, others classified as in-group or out-group. We have the sense of I consciousness versus we consciousness. We have an idea of privacy versus belonging. Everyone is supposed to take care of him or herself and her immediate family. That's immediate family, nuclear family primarily, but may extend to grandparents or maybe first cousins. And then there are, in collectivism, you have people born into large extended families or clans. These are all things that obviously put an individualist people at a disadvantage in a political system where you have people coming in that are more collectivist. They don't need to specifically think about what they're doing in being able to take out the individualist people. The individualist people are naturally not going to be unconsciously forming themselves into collectivist groups to defend their collective interests in the political process against collectivist groups that are unconscious about the way in which they approach political activism. And that's one of the reasons why integration of different kinds of cultures into a single political entity will inevitably end up with collectivist peoples dominating individualist peoples. And this is one of the reasons why white supremacy, which is essentially white people or more individualistic people, seeing themselves as a collective to defend their collective interests. White supremacy is identified with this kind of conscious activity because of the fact that other groups can obtain resources from the individualist groups, and those resources are actually quite substantial when you look at individualism and national wealth. We have here the correlation between individualism and the log of the GDP. Now, the log of the GDP means that you get an actually very large increase in the GDP with an increase of individualism. So it's very attractive for collectivist cultures to batter down the barriers of immigration to enter into the political systems of the individualist peoples. I want to go over a response that I made to this. I'm not going to go much further into this at the present point in time. It's been down quite a ways. Let's see if I can even find it. There it is. There are two things that I pointed out in my response here. The thing I want to talk about most directly is the GLL, which is an oxytocin receptor gene. Among North and Western Europeans in particular, you've got a lot of this variant that in a homozygous state, in other words, when you have inbreeding for this gene, it is associated with having empathy for animals. And the coevolution with wolves, in my hypothesis that I've set forth about the natural history of individualism in Europeans, the coevolution with wolves is something that contributed to the independence of the head of the nuclear family household in Paleolithic Europeans. And this particular gene appears, in my opinion, to be a sign of the cross-domestication between wolves and humans. In other words, humans were domesticated by wolves as at the same time that humans were domesticating wolves. And one of the genetic markers of our domestication is the presence of this GLL, which provides greater empathy with animals that originally was associated with the wolves replacing other humans in the hunting pack, providing the head of the household of Europeans more independence for calorie acquisition. In short, it's exceedingly important to understand that individualism contributes to value of both a social and economic nature, and that it's imperative that more collectivist cultures be excluded from societies that have high individualism as an innate characteristic of the population.